And so there was a protest of probably the largest protest in Evanston's recent history of several hundreds of people in the suburb just north of the city. And the same quote was used on both protests by speakers quoting Martin Luther King. And I was a little disturbed by the quote. They said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. People like quotes like that because it sounds very grandiose. And I thought, I don't really agree with that. And I went to find out, because I usually like what Martin Luther King has to say, since he was a phenomenally poetic speaker. And I went and looked up the actual words, and he gave this, he said that in a speech before the Southern Christian Leadership Council in 1967. And what he actually said was, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But it's still not so good, because it gives you the idea that somehow history is this sort of thing that inevitably is kind of flowing our way and going to happen no matter what. So, go out, have a drink, and don't bother. But actually, the entire preceding passage that he speaks is all about the setbacks and the cul-de-sacs, and then moments forward, and then the regroupment, and the lessons that are learned, and then ends his passage with that quote. And I felt quite a bit better about it. And I thought that's exactly the point, because I think that what people are pouring out into the streets over, and not obviously just in California, but 10,000 in Boston, thousands out in New York and Chicago and Pittsburgh, all over the place in this country, is that people are actually acknowledging there's also moments in which history can be given a bit of a shove and catapulted forward through the conscious activity of people. And I think you look through throughout the United States history. I mean, certainly slavery. It wasn't just that sort of abolitionist meetings got a little bit bigger all the time, and then the slave rebellion sort of slowly grew in some sort of linear fashion towards the end of slavery. We didn't go from misery to liberation that way. Actually, it took a bloody civil war that not only murdered millions of people, but laid waste to an entire region of this country in order to end slavery. And same thing with women's rights. I mean, the convention was in 1848 in Seneca Falls, and it took another 80 years before women even got the right to vote, and then decades more to have the most fundamental right to control your own body and get abortion rights, not till 1973. And the same, of course, can be said of gay rights. And one of the things, and we can talk about in the conversation, that I really loved about the Harvey Milk movie, Milk, is that it starts in a very interesting place, in an unexpected place. And a number of people have asked me about the film footage that opens up the movie. Because, of course, it's taking place in the 1970s, and folks are somewhat aware that it was in 1969 when the modern gay movement sort of exploded onto the scene in New York City outside of the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, in which 6 nights in a row of rioting took place and then gave birth to organizations like the Gay Liberation Front, etc. And yet the movie shows the 1970s, and not in Mississippi, but in San Francisco and in New York, where there are police raids on bars, where they show newspapers with names listed of people who were, entrapped for solicitation. It's clearly not just for congressmen. And, in toilets, your name would be listed in a newspaper and you would lose your job. And that these draconian laws remained in existence throughout the 1970s, and of course many of them remain to this day, and how it actually took an ongoing struggle, and how the people who engaged in those actions, Harvey Milk himself, which is one of the brilliant things about that film, is a transformed figure. This is not a man who was born a radical. I mean, he actually, they don't mention it, they sort of allude to his sort of Republican past in the movie. I don't want to give too much away. He does die. But he actually, in 1964, Harvey Milk, he campaigned for Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a nasty, segregationist bigot. And this is who Harvey Milk was campaigning for in 1964 while he was a stockbroker on Wall Street and later became an insurance agent and whatever, closeted and all the rest. And he leaves all of that behind. In other words, human beings are actually shaped by what is going on around them. And I think, you know, what Rose was just talking about, I think, is a perfect entree into this discussion, because really I think this, the way the mainstream media often talks about it, and the way we're told about it in schools and, you know, in church or synagogue or mosque or wherever, is that, you know, people are either this way or they're that way. And hello, people have mixed consciousness and actually can shift and must shift and do shift. And we as socialists are kind of banking on it, because if this is all it's at, we're in trouble. But that it is the conscious intervention of organized forces has always been instrumental in giving history a shove, and that human beings actually are shaped by the circumstances around them, as well as making those circumstances. And I think one of the things I want to say about the moment we're in around the Prop 8 struggle, I mean, we talk about it as like, you know, been going on forever. I mean, it's, you know, 4 weeks. Is that I think the spontaneity of it all is magnificent, but it's also, there are limitations to the spontaneity. And I think that often when it's talked about, although I don't agree with talking about it sort of like there's spontaneity over here, and then there's, you know, long detailed meetings, you know, drawing out maps of next steps. But really, the fact that these protests on a mass scale were organized on Facebook is sort of an extraordinary statement of both the absence of a genuine gay rights movement in this country, to say nothing of a gay liberation movement, and also the, of course, the power of the internet, but also the fact that people are looking for something and are trying to figure out a way forward. And in cities like San Francisco, you know, and LA, San Diego, I was just down there this week, as well as in Chicago and New York and many other cities, people were beginning to organize and debate through, where do we go from here? Because spontaneity and outrage and hope, and that's what's so magnificent about this. I mean, it's sort of extraordinary. People going out there with the absolute expectation of winning, and, you know, yes, we can, and all the rest of that. It's brilliant. It's sort of, even the evolution of that slogan, I think, is brilliant. You know, the immigrant rights movement raises it, the Obama campaign takes it, and now it's sort of being taken back by the movement. There's a sort of give and take there. But it shows some of the limitations of the existing organizations out there, like Human Rights Campaign and the No on 8 forces that did what they did in terms of developing what really, I think, are orchestrating a colossal failure. I read a quote in Rolling Stone the other day about this. A Democratic consultant. This is a Democratic consultant who leads the strategizing in California. This is what he said about the Prop 8 campaign. He said, "This was political malpractice. They fucked this up, and it was painful to watch." He was the consultant. They said they shouldn't be allowed to pawn this off on the Mormons or anyone else. They snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, and now hundreds of thousands of gay couples are going to pay the price. And that is unfortunately quite true. But clearly, there are tens of thousands of people, and perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people in this country who have every intention of doing something about it. And I think we should talk a little bit about how we move forward from here, because I think that the organizing now of this spontaneity requires some political lead, some political orientation in order to take a phenomenal instinct of hitting the streets to try and right a colossal wrong. But we also have to take on some arguments. That's why I wrote the Black Gay Divide piece, because I really feel that this argument, which really is fundamentally not only ignorant, but actually quite racist. The idea that, you know, 6.2% of the population in the state of California, which was 10% of the vote, is what was dominant, is what determinant in this vote. As if there's something glowing about 49% of white people voting for it. You know, that's been absent. But it also is in defiance of what the research shows. The fact that, you know, studies over a 30-year period coming to quite interesting conclusions. The Georgia State study, I think, is fascinating. The fact that they found that, you know, many blacks when polled tend to have higher degrees